Hey there, welcome to the Drawing Codex. In this video, we're going to do a simple drawing lesson where we focus on how to draw the figure for stylized art. This is something that you might need if you're drawing comics or manga or concept art or something else where what we want to do is learn anatomy, learn how to draw the figure, but we want to exaggerate it or stylize it in a particular way. What I'm going to do is combine a couple of concepts for this particular drawing lesson. I'm going to take a lot of the ideas that you might find in general how to draw books, especially the sort of figure drawing for all it's worth by Andrew Loomis, which I think is a really just good example of this tradition of learning to draw. But we're going to apply it to stylized art. And a good example of the ethos that I sort of follow and that I'm going to sort of use is stuff that you would find in the traditional Capcom Street Fighter sort of art, right? The legacy Capcom art. And the idea here is that we're taking reality, we're drawing all the muscle groups, we're trying to focus on form and structure, perspective, making things solid, but we're exaggerating it and we're pushing it as far as we can in terms of just making it fun and cool. Anyway, that's the idea here. Let's jump in and get started. My name's Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and I do a lot of this professionally day to day, drawing figures for comic books or concept art, etc. What we hear about on this channel, the Drawing Codex, is drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you're interested in learning more about the line and color style that we use for comics, you can check out my free Quick Start Guide. It goes over my basic tips for how to develop your own simple line and color process in Photoshop. This is the same technique that I use for my concept art or comics, basically everything I do. It's free, the link will be in the description. So the basic idea that we want to get is this idea of hyperreality. And again, you can see this as a good representation of what I'm talking about, the traditional Capcom art that you can find in a book like Capcom Design Works, which is just a classic, sort of really nice art book. And the idea here, as I said, is that we're focusing on structure. We're trying to make things three-dimensional, but we're exaggerating things. We're creating this hyper reality. And I think that's often what is so fun about comics and manga and sort of stylized art in general. Now, the question is, how do we get there? How do we build our ability to do that, to create those exaggerated sort of fun poses? Well, there's a lot of good information, as I sort of keep saying, in traditional how to draw books. And what I want to talk about today and sort of demonstrate is how we bridge that gap, specifically in this case for posing the figure. Now, the idea that you'll find in the Loomis book is actually pretty simple. And we'll jump over to the drawing desk in a minute, and I'll give you like plenty of tips and practical advice for how to actually apply this. But the general concept is important to grasp, and it's basically that what we're doing is taking a mannequin or a puppet version of our full figure that is very much linked to the skeleton. The skeleton is the thing that doesn't necessarily change that much as it moves. If you think about my shoulder, and the shoulder joint here of the skeleton, if that sort of moves around quite a bit, you know, the shoulder is probably one of the parts of the body that articulates and changes its form the most. At the skeleton phase, it doesn't really change that much. So it's a good idea when we're posing to stick to the basics and the things that are going to give us a lot of gesture and help us understand what the actual figure is going to look like, but don't sort of make us focus on drawing all of that musculature on top. What we do after that, if we get the sort of more muscular version of that, is that we essentially have techniques for building up the major forms and then the secondary and tertiary forms of the anatomy. Now, that is the basic ethos of a traditional sort of drawing from imagination or just general drawing practice that you'll find, again, in a book like Figure Drawing for All It's Worth by Andrew Loomis. And again, I'll describe and show you how that kind of works there. But that's the core, right? Just remember most of the time that's what people are doing. We're using a simple skeletal sort of version of the character. and we then kind of build muscle on top. Now, it's kind of that, classic drawing joke where you sort of, draw a circle or something and then, you just kind of say add detail, right? It's the devil is in those details, and it is a big challenge to kind of add and figure out how all those muscle groups go together. But the most important thing to begin with is the base proportions of the figure. If you get those wrong, it doesn't matter how well you know the anatomical groups that go on top. If you get the basic size of the arms wrong, then nothing else matters, right? It doesn't really matter what else you do. It's always going to look wrong. So even when you're exaggerating, often, as I've sort of said before, what your goal is to basically modify that sort of basic set of proportions. If you want really big chunky chests and big sort of, chunky arms and things, we just modify the skeleton a little bit, but we modify the musculature a lot. And the basic mannequin that we draw in that case can change a little bit, but the basic idea here is pretty simple. And it's really just a matter of implementing it, which is what I'm going to show you now. All right, so here we are at the drawing table. Now, I'm going to combine these different elements, as I said, and I'm going to be drawing my lion warrior character here, which actually has a lot of influence from some of those sort of old Capcom arcade games that I played back in the day. It's important to understand whenever you're tackling any sort of drawing project, especially when you're learning, that you need to have your intent set right in the beginning. One of the big challenges here is that there's many, many different ways to draw, and that's why, again, I sort of state that what I'm going to be trying to do is kind of hit this idea of this Capcom stylized but very solid and technically well executed drawing. This is something that influenced me a lot when I was starting out, and again, I think is a good middle ground between exaggeration and emotion, and really having a lot of character, but also keeping things very solid and grounded and structural. And again, you may have some slightly different goals, but what I'm going to try and do is show you how you would sort of start to learn these things and apply these concepts. This Lion Warrior character is a tutorial that actually is on the Drawing Codex channel. You can see this image being created from beginning to end, but it focuses mostly on process, the techniques of how you create this in Photoshop and how you get from the thumbnail to the finished image. What I want to focus on today is the drawing, is the thought that goes into that initial phase where we pose the character and start to build anatomy on top. To do that, what we're going to do is firstly just discuss the concepts that are underlying certainly my drawing process, but also a lot of really useful information that you can find in traditional figure drawing books that is not always clear how you translate that to sort of drawing, cool things, because they look a little bit different. Now, I have made other videos on this channel sort of discussing similar concepts that sort of go over the theory maybe in a little bit more detail that you can check out. This is going to be about how to apply it. So I'm going to take the basic idea here of mannequinizing the figure, and we'll just sort of go over roughly how that sort of functions and how the basic proportions of general anatomy work, because that'll give you an idea for how I'm actually applying these concepts. But as I said, the idea here is really important to grasp because it's a powerful one. And if you understand this thought process, as you see, it's very easy to apply it to different things. Once you understand it, it's a lot easier to let go and be more creative. Now, if we look at our general sort of skeleton proportion here, you can understand, as I said, a pretty good visual representation of what's going on. These are more medical grade artistic reference écorchés that detail the anatomical features, and it's very useful to have some type of reference like this. I talk about this concept in my advice for learning anatomy, another video that's on the channel. But this is something we can reference, but at the moment I'm just talking about the overall idea that's going to frame what we're doing. And that is that the Loomis method or other sort of, most sort of drawing methods cover a similar idea. And that is that we sort of start with a mannequin frame that, again, has a lot in common with the skeleton. And what we're trying to do there is allow ourselves to memorize proportion so that we can then pose this figure. As I said earlier in the video, that's one of the key things that allows you to quickly play around with posing while you're not really worrying too much about how the muscle groups modify themselves as the joints bend and sort of deform. So that's the basic idea. That's what we're doing. And the first task, if you sort of want an exercise, is to kind of just make sure you're able to control proportion in some way, shape, or form. You have to be able to replicate some set of proportions from image to image as you go. If we look at how this set of proportions, get that back in frame, if we look at how this set of proportions is going to help us, it's actually really simple and really interesting. What we're doing is learning where all of the different landmarks of a typical westernized figure are going to land. Once we learn that, or if you just want to go straight to learning a different one, you can then modify this to create something that is going to be more heroic, or, as I said, have something that feels like it has a lot more character, like those other sort of Capcom designs. But as I always say, the key is proportion. This is the thing that links this to this, is that the Street Fighter characters and other sort of art that's created by those Capcom artists back in that time has its own set of proportions that's very consistent, and you can see that the characters are consistent within themselves, but each of them has their own sort of exaggerated set of proportion. The trick there is just to understand simply that if you can control proportion, then you can modify it yourself and sort of create interesting poses and ideas. But let's just start with the standard sort of anatomical proportion to give you an idea for what you're doing. A good exercise is to just try and draw those same proportions and see if you can keep it consistent. A good way that I like to think of this and explain how this concept is useful is to think about the idea of how you actually apply proportion. And often what's happening is that if we're sort of doing a little, sketch of a character, right, and trying to sort of pose something, what we're doing is we're sort of starting somewhere. You have to sort of start somewhere, right? You have to, at some point, kind of put down a first line. And I think this is where these sort of mechanistic systems can feel a bit sort of stifling, because I think everyone probably starts drawing their figures from different sort of angles, right? Everyone has their own sort of thing that they like to start with. They have their own thing that's important to them. And to a certain degree, I think that will change from drawing to drawing or scenario to scenario. So proportion is the thing that allows us to understand where we are in any given drawing and then work our way from that. There's no sort of rule that you need to start with the head and work down, or start with the body. If you understand proportion, then it's very easy to start with the head and work down, or start with the feet and work up, because we understand the proportion of the feet relative to the head. We understand where the knees are in relation to the shoulders, etc. That's why doing these fairly boring, mundane studies is valuable. So the way that I like to break this down is very generalized and probably deviates a little bit towards simplicity versus the 100% realistic sort of anatomical model that, again, you might see in a proper sort of anatomical écorché or something like that. So I'm optimizing this for simplicity. And the way I do that is basically just say, well, we've kind of got our character, right? And if I just sort of draw them here, right, just quickly so you can kind of see roughly what that proportion is going to be. So I'm basing a lot of these proportions just on eye, right? When I'm doing them at this point, right, I'm just sort of doing this by eye. But the way that we sort of practice and get our ability to do this to improve is by looking very closely at the proportions we're going to see in an anatomy book like this, and sort of, step on the shoulders of someone who's done it before, right? That is the power of the art book, is you have someone like Andrew Loomis or whoever is writing an art book, and they've kind of figured this out. Hey, here's a cool way to break it down. Here's a cool way to sort of think about what lines up with what. And, then here's a good example of how they break it down and sort of allow themselves to pose the figure. That really is the value here. So the way I break it down is to kind of think of the figure as broken up into two separate parts, right? There's the bottom, which is essentially the legs, and then there's the top, which is the torso and the head. And we divide that pretty much in half. Now, the knees are going to be pretty much halfway up that sort of bottom proportion. And what we do with this top proportion is to divide it up into 4 equal points. So essentially, if we look at our, let's do it up here, right? If we sort of look at the overall set of proportions there, we've got 1, 2 large proportions there, right? And we can sort of see this here. I'm sure these legs could be a little bit longer. Right, we've essentially got the top, and then we've got the bottom. Right, 1, 2. And then the next thing we do is think about where do the head and the torso, etc. fit here. Now, a good indication that I sort of find is that we're going to have our rib cage roughly take up these middle 2. So if we think about 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4 proportions. And again, I think the problem is when you first sort of look at people drawing this, it's just sort of really boring and technical and mathematical. It's hard to explain how this stuff works, but certainly the way I memorize it is very much sort of visual and graphic and from a drawing perspective. So you spend a lot of time understanding this and maybe finding a book that works for you, but at the end of the day, it's mostly visual. There's not a lot of numbers in it. So as we can see, what I'm doing is defining here this torso area, the rib cage. And you can see that on the skeleton. This is one of the major sort of big land masses that we're trying to sort of find. And it is a real sort of egg-shaped ovally thing. And as you can see, yeah, it really sort of comes and pops up above the shoulders there. We don't really have to be accurate with that. We're not trying to make it sort of highly accurate, but the general idea is very well taken. We're going to have shoulders around there, and we're going to have the head sort of take up roughly this first quadrant of the top half. The neck is going to come down there. Now, also, if you look at the general sort of proportion, you'll see that the pelvis or the crotch area, the bottom of the pelvis is sort of just sitting on that halfway line. And that basically means that what we're going to do is draw this. You can almost think of them as sort of 2 plates, right? We've sort of got 2 plates, right? Got a plate here, right? And a plate here. And what they're representing from an anatomical sort of standpoint is this sort of pelvic region, right? So you kind of have this form here, and a lot of those things are visible. So that's kind of what is being sort of demonstrated and indicated there. And then we sort of have these right bones, sort of hip bones. And then, as you can see with that anatomy, right, that's going down. You've got a knee, right? Oh, this probably, I think normally from an anatomical standpoint, again, this is going to duck in, go down, then you've got a foot. Right, so that's the basic idea of how that works. With the torso, again, you can see a couple of things are typically going to line up. We've got the bottom of the rib cage is going to sort of line up there. And it sort of lines up, you'll find typically with the navel or the belly button, that's going to sort of be around here, and the elbow. So all of those things line up at the bottom of this sort of third quadrant here, right, just around there. And as you can see, we're going to have some shoulders right, slash start of the arm that is going to be about here. And that, yeah, is going to sort of hit the elbow around that area. And then we're basically just going to sort of duplicate that distance. Right, again, I'm being super, super rough here. But that's really all we need to do, because we're going to stylize and exaggerate later on. Again, our goal is not to create a highly, highly realistic version of this, but the more of this we understand, the better. And the more we understand of how this relates to our stylized sort of interesting art, the better. Now, another sort of, again, sorry, just to get this back, another sort of thing that is sort of good from a landmark perspective is to understand that, again, these arms are sort of going to, the hand is going to fit around the bottom of that crotch area. So if we think about this as being around about halfway up the figure, right, on my sort of halfway line, that's kind of where the hand stops. Sorry, the forearm stops and the hand begins. And then we're going to have our hand mass. Now, another sort of good proportional marker that's very, very useful is that typically you're going to see that the hand is going to end about one hand's breadth above the knee. Again, that's a rough indication. Some people will have a lot longer arms than others. There's no standard deviation. You can really notice this with, if you watch any sort of martial arts sports or anything like that. Some people have a very long reach and some people don't. You can have very tall people, someone who's, 5 inches taller than someone, but, their arms will be a lot shorter. Some people will have arms that are really, really going to hang down. Other people, their arms might be a little bit up. So there's a huge amount of variation in this, right? And that's why mostly what we're trying to do here when you learn this is learn to carry and understand proportion across the figure, right? So if we can replicate that, that's good. If we then want to sort of say, oh, well, this guy's got really sort of broad shoulders, then that's sort of what we do. But at its core, this little mannequin is what we're trying to understand. And the first step for you to understand it is probably just to practice drawing it from front on and from the side. And once you've done that, it just helps you to control proportion. So that's probably the first sort of exercise. Now, there's a lot of detail on different things that we could talk about when it comes to how to handle the whole process of drawing a figure. In this video, I want to focus on the general idea. So just demonstrating how this is going to work in general terms. I will do another video that sort of goes over how you would ideate and create many, many different poses. And I can also create another video that sort of goes into how to construct the anatomy maybe in a little bit more detail. For now, let's just focus on understanding the basic concept and how this happens. So we start by sort of thinking about what is the mannequin for this character. So we can see they're fairly broad-shouldered, fairly chunky, fairly tall, very sort of heroic proportions, certainly relative to the size of the head. And all that means is I'm just going to sort of maybe exaggerate that mannequin a little bit. Now, it takes you a long time to really get good at replicating a mannequin from page to page if you're drawing a comic. So if you mess this up and you're having trouble with this, just understand that is a very high-level technique to be able to replicate the exact look of a character from page to page. Don't expect that to happen immediately. But what we're going to do to begin with is just think about how we would draw this character if we're doing just a simple sort of 3/4 pose. We'll start that. And then we'll think about how we sort of create different poses from that. So again, you can start however you want. You can sort of start by being a little bit sort of loose. You don't even necessarily need to 100% stick to just drawing the mannequin. You can start these things any way you want. But again, I'm going to start it as sort of analytically as I can. And what I'm doing is starting by roughing in that torso. Now, because as I said, you can start these things however you want, I don't need to think about there being a right or wrong way to start or a right or wrong size for the torso. I am sort of trying to keep and make sure that, look, the character's going to fit somewhere in here, right? I know that we're not going to blow that out in some crazy, exaggerated way. But this is where, again, I can just make sure I get the basics of this first rough in correct. And we'll talk about, again, how we can sort of change the pose and do a little bit of interesting stuff. But for the moment, again, I'm just trying to get the basic idea here. So you can see I'm sticking pretty close to the realistic proportions here, and we'll just see what that looks like. But it is always a good idea to, extend the legs a little bit if you want to have a very sort of heroic type character. Obviously, there is a lot of perspective and form drawing as well that will help you to draw these characters in 3 dimensions. A good place to start is just to think about how the ground plane is going to be situated and make sure that you're just thinking about how the character's feet are interacting with the ground plane, and again, sort of where the horizon line is. So we've got a very sort of flat character drawing here. I'm not worried too much about that stuff, but that is something that's very much worth thinking about and learning about. As with all drawing, the real challenge with teaching drawing is that everything is interconnected. So that's often why when we start someone off with drawing education, it starts with very boring concepts so that when we're here, we can sort of talk about them. But again, in this, we're just doing practical demonstration. So you can see I'm sort of applying some of those concepts here, but I'm modifying the proportions a little bit. Again, this guy has very big, long, animalistic hands, so I am drawing them down quite a bit and exaggerating those proportions. But I'm still thinking about that same general idea. In the same way, I'm probably going to exaggerate and maybe move the head up a little bit just so we can draw a big neck and get some of those things on there. You can start finishing one part of the drawing as long as you understand, how to modify the rest and, create the rest with your mannequin stick figure. But this is the basic idea. This is how we start. So we start with a real simple stick figure, and then we sort of add muscle, which is its own challenge, its own problem. And what I'm going to do is start by just building as much of the anatomy first before I put some of the clothes or costume elements on. To a certain degree, we might not even worry about doing too much of that. You can just kind of make this an anatomical. So again, there's many different ways to block in and add muscle. A lot of this is going to depend on your personality and what you like doing. We could think about it very structurally using our form drawing concepts that you may have learnt. And this is where we're going to think primarily about a center line, right? I'm thinking about the center line of where that torso is, and I'm going to build up and almost sort of create chunky, blocky versions of some of these sort of pectoral muscles, right? As an example, right? So it's almost like I'm sort of taking, let's draw it here so we can see, right? So it's almost like I'm taking this kind of egg shape of the torso, and then I'm kind of adding big blocks to it. And this is where a lot of what people give as advice for understanding the basic forms, the primary forms, is going to be really useful, because that kind of is what I'm doing. That is basically the general idea. And we can think about the deltoids here as being big, sort of football-sized, chunky shapes, and we basically build it up in a constructive manner. But again, there's many different ways to sort of mass out the form. You can also just kind of let it flow a little bit more and think about massing in these shapes and anatomical forms as being, a little bit looser, a little bit more organic. It's very much up to how you see the world and how much, angularity you want to see in the finished product. But certainly, again, there's a lot of value to both sort of methods or different ways to sort of view this. So I've got my torso, I've got my skeletal structure here that's pretty sort of set, and what you would imagine really is this character is like a very bodybuilder level chunky character, so they probably have a lot of musculature that is, also going to be made up of just bigger bones, right? It's just like a large character. And in that case, again, the more you want to move towards that, the more you're going to want to modify the mannequin to sort of support that. But when you're learning, it's really valuable to just understand that if we add our little skeleton, we can basically add, as much musculature to that as we want. You can, make that skinny little skeleton as big as you want. It's really just a matter of sort of adding muscles and adding stuff to it. So, as I said, different methodologies. You can also, insofar as you maybe already understand where some of that musculature goes, you can sort of make some guesses at it. And in the end, often what you'll find is there's ways that you can study or improve your general drawing ability by focusing on this structure, right? Really thinking about, okay, let's block this out, right? Let's think about the structure here. This will help you to get better overall, and this will also allow you to problem solve. Often what's happening when we're actually doing it, though, is we're doing a mix of blocking out some things, massing out other things, and then just kind of saying, you know what, I probably have a decent idea of how to draw that, so I'm just going to try and draw it, right? And it's a combination of different ideas, different methodologies, and that's fine. Don't ever feel like you should be doing it a particular way if what you're doing is working. However, as I said, from an exercise standpoint, the more you can maybe focus on, thinking about the structure, blocking everything out, maybe focusing on primary forms first, the easier it will be for you to improve. It is really important, however, to focus on the primary forms first if you're struggling. So the primary forms are these big shapes, right? It is these big, chunky shapes that are really going to make a difference. And this is where we really break things down into our cylinder, our box, and again, your sort of egg shapes or spherical shapes, etc. The reason for this is that it's very easy when you're beginning to accidentally go too far. As you get more advanced, it's a lot easier to spot mistakes as they come and fix them. Whereas one of the major problems that you'll probably run into is that you kind of work up a really nice deltoid over here, but you then realize it's just the wrong size, i.e. the primary form, the container that it needs to fit into relative to all of the other muscular groups is wrong. And that's why it really pays to focus initially on primary forms. So that's what we'll do. We'll try and build out some of the basic primary forms for some of these legs. So again, most of what I'm doing here is just thinking about these legs as being like a chicken wing or sort of, your sort of chicken leg or something like that. What we have is our skeleton, and we've got a bunch of muscles here that are going to take up the prime movers up here. As we get towards the joint, things get a little bit sort of smaller. And then as we get to the calf muscles, right, things get bigger. So that's the basic idea. Now, as you look at your anatomy books, you will both either take the approach of understanding exactly where all those muscles are, where they go, where they insert, or you can just look at a lot of the very practical tips for how things are drawn. And that can be, there's a really sort of good tip to remember if if you can't remember which bit of the calf goes this way and which one goes that way, you can think of this concept, right? And that's that we've got our leg and we sort of have this line here that points in and that line that points out. Again, it would be like this on the other side. And what that tells us is where this heel and ankle bone kind of connect. So you've got two, if we look at our anatomical sort of reference, again, here it's a little bit sort of hidden, but you're typically going to have sort of your little, get that sort of in frame, you're going to have this little part of your sort of foot articulation, ankle articulation there, right? That little kind of bottom of the bone. You're going to have the same sort of thing here, right? This guy. And then you've got this one on the inside. And what you tend to find is that, if we flip that up, is that the slope, right, the inside one is higher than the outside one. That's the basic anatomical takeaway. Now, I don't want to make this a video just made up of a million of those, but the point is, many of these little takeaways exist. And the more of these you memorize, the easier it becomes to then structurally go in and remember, like, oh, that's right, inside of the calf, the point, the apex of the curve is a little bit lower than on the outside. And again, that's just one of those little passed on through the centuries little takeaways that you can use and again take away and apply to your own drawings. The concept there is that there's many of these and you can learn them. You can also just really study anatomy and figure out exactly where all those muscles are and sort of have a good map of it. But often what people do, again, is a mix. You do a mix of these things where you sort of have these little things that you remember. Similar sort of concept would be if we're thinking about, what goes on with the shoulder. You can remember and understand all of the different musculature groups and how they weave into each other. If you look at sort of an anatomical model, you can sort of understand, oh, this one's going here, and this one's going here, and this one's going here, and this one's going there. And, you can get a very, very deep level of it. Or you can just really try and remember the basic sort of concept, which is that typically the pectoral muscle is going to sort of go underneath the deltoid muscle on a very sort of large scale, i.e. when you're thinking about the lines that you normally actually make, it's that the pectoral goes underneath the deltoid and then the bicep kind of goes underneath both. And so you can just get that very basic concept of pectoral, deltoid, bicep, right? Or pectoral, deltoid, bicep, right? But it's just the idea that the bicep is sort of going to go, right? If you look at it from an anatomical model, right, the bicep is sort of going in and it really inserts like well underneath the pectoral and well underneath the deltoid. Again, these are just examples of things that you can find that will really help, because if you kind of memorize this, then it makes a lot of this stuff easier. You don't really need to know exactly what's going on because you've just got a nice little thing to memorize. So what we do from here is just begin to sort of build out the figure. We've got a pretty good indication of the primary forms, and it's because I've set up the proportions initially to look decent that I can sort of comfortably work down here, and I don't have to worry that, oh, the arms are looking really, weird or really big or really small. Now, with that said, I am making slight adjustments here to make sure that, this character feels like they could be this sort of chunky. And even so, you can see that, again, I'm still not getting quite as big as that. But again, the idea is very similar. With drawing demos, it's always the case that the more I focus on trying to talk about what's important, the less I kind of, follow a particular drawing or you make it look really good. So that's what we're doing here. So again, we've got the same sort of concept, and the mannequin again has this kind of basic foot. Now, what you need to do is build your understanding of how those feet work and, how you sort of add detail to them. As I said, again, we can use these same concepts here. Right, I can sort of line up from a perspective standpoint, right? I have a rough sort of grid. I know where all of these things are going to be. We can look at that one. One of the things that I like to do from a construction standpoint to make the feet easy is to draw a sort of ball as the heel of the foot. And that is where we sort of are calculating where that foot connects to the ground. And then again, I'm sort of going to draw another sort of, right? So if we think about this from a structural standpoint, right, I've got a ball, which is the heel of the foot, right, ironically, and then the ball of the foot is almost like a flat sort of mark that I'm putting on the ground. And once I've got those, it's pretty easy to sort of start to connect them up, because I can easily, right, I've sort of got the basic shapes of the foot there. And that's kind of what I do, right? We've sort of got these, and then I've got some toes, and again, I'm sort of running out of fidelity with my pencil there, but if we were to go and add secondary forms to this, then that's kind of how that would happen. So this is, again, just how we progress through the figure and how we deal with a very simple pose. Now, again, we could sort of add all the extra bits and pieces. That's probably a video for another day. But I do want to demonstrate how this works at a smaller scale when we sort of pose the character and do it differently. So just keep in mind a few things. Is I'm just focusing on primary forms here. If I was to detail this out, this would probably, take quite a bit longer from a drawing perspective, and I'm just trying to be brief. The idea to take away from this is just how we go from our stick figure, where we focus on proportion and then sort of build it out. Again, the big takeaway that I think is really important is you're in control of this. It's your journey, it's your drawing. You can figure out the methods that work best for you. In my experience, it is very good to practice doing this kind of blocky stuff. I think that's really helpful. But when I'm applying it, I'm often doing a mix of everything. Sometimes I'm just kind of saying, well, this looks like how I think the forearm might look from that angle. In other ways, in other times, I'm really trying to say, no, I need to really figure out the structure of it. Otherwise, I don't think I'm going to be able to execute that drawing. In other cases, I'm just kind of squiggling around and saying, like, this looks like it might be a fun shape. And as you progress and as you get better and better, these things become easier and easier. But don't be surprised and don't be upset, again, if you find yourself doing a mix of stuff. Just remember that focusing on primary forms and proportion are normally going to be the things that you're going to get wrong in the beginning. If someone comes to me with a drawing and there's a problem with it, right, I can easily bet that the problem is going to be lying in primary forms and proportion. So that is where you need to really focus in the beginning. And that does mean when you practice in the beginning, your drawings are going to look a little bit stiff, a little bit technical, and that's fine, because it's the process of you refining your ability to remember to focus on primary forms, remember to get that proportion right with your skeleton, and then figure out kind of like how you combine them, right? So it is a messy process. It's not like a linear thing. You need to focus a lot on these really technical form-based exercises if you want to get that kind of structural feeling that you're going to see in those kind of Capcom illustrations, etc. But then when you actually apply it as the years flow by, as you get better at this, you'll find again naturally that the process becomes a lot more intuitive, a lot more natural, and a lot more artistic. Anyway, let's jump into the next section where I'm going to talk about how we do the same thing, but I'll do it as a smaller little version, and we'll talk about how to pose the character using some different poses. Alright, so keep in mind I'm going to be drawing this line guide. These are the general sort of proportions I'm sort of aiming for. This is what I have in my head. And once you understand the basic approach and what's being discussed, and you've sort of seen me sort of step through it with a static figure, the trick is just that we can do the same thing with a posed figure, doing things where the character is moving or dancing, etc. Now, I'm not going to really delve too much into foreshortening or creating really, really crazy angles here. Again, just because I think that might sort of take a little bit of extra time. So we'll just do some simple poses here, and then we'll talk about how, again, we sort of do exactly the same thing as we did in the previous section. So what we do here is just work with ideating different sort of postures. Now, this is something that you can start, as I said, from any particular angle. You can start it by focusing on structure. You can start it by focusing on different relationships between different parts of the anatomy set. So just figuring out like where the head is in relation to the torso can be a really interesting way to kind of think about poses. And if you're actually looking at like, well, okay, how do you come up with sort of different poses? And well, there's a variety of things. Again, often you have an idea for what you want to do, so we don't need to really worry too much about what the pose is. But if you're trying to practice this, it can be really useful to set yourself a goal to say, let's do a bunch of sketches where we're dealing with characters who are sword fighting. So that might be something, again, that I'll sort of play around with here. But it could be anything. It could be do 20 poses where, that's not quite in the right spot, 20 poses of someone sitting on a chair. You could set yourself very specific goals in terms of doing one character doing 20 things, and you could have 20 ideas that you're trying to hit. The goal here is that we want to both be able to just spontaneously play around with posture. In that case, I think mostly what we're doing is just thinking about what looks cool, what shapes are interesting, what creates dynamic flow within the character, what gives you the feeling that the character is posed in a way that it represents the feeling you want to get across in your drawing. It's very simple. You can also work on your ability to just make it really clear that a character is doing a certain thing. So, you might say, okay, I've got my lion character, right? We've got our lion character. How do they sit down? Because how everyone sits down is different. And in that case, again, we can just think about, okay, we've got a chair. Now, it may be a more interesting chair than that, but we'll just start with this as a base. Now, I know that the person is going to sit roughly with that torso sitting on the pelvic area, right? We've got these sort of two plates. Now, again, I'm just being rough. I'm being gestural because my goal here is to think about what's happening, to feel my way through a posture. And what we can do is just think about, well, how's that going to relate to the torso? So how does this character move? And this is where, again, having the stick figure is really useful because it's quick. It's easy to kind of quickly ideate. So I can sort of think about, again, using a lot of perspective guesstimation here that I've, perfected or at least learnt over many decades of drawing. So don't expect a lot of your structural stuff to work out as well if you haven't done the structural perspective stuff. But I can think about, how's he going to sit? He's very heavy. Maybe he kind of crouches, right? Maybe he is almost like having trouble keeping his weight up. you know, maybe he needs to rest one arm on his thigh there, right? And again, maybe he's got one arm, right? Like almost like this elbow is kind of resting on the thigh, right? Coming down. So we've got one hand here. Again, you can play around with this idea of the stick figure. And, you know, as we, you know, if we wanted to sort of build it out, right, it's just going to be same thing, right? We sort of give him his big beard. He's got sort of a shoulder pad here. Again, this is very sort of gestural, right? So, you know, we're running out of reasonable detail with our pencil, but this is often how we find poses with these little stick figures. But we start with that stick figure, and then we think, yeah, how would that person be? How would they sit on a chair? How would that work? And then you might try it from a different angle. Then you might try it from a different feeling. You know, maybe they sit upright, maybe they sit down, etc., etc. But it's really this core of understanding the relationship of your major landmarks and how they connect with each other that will allow you to play around with that posture and try it. If we think about a sort of more triumphant posture, right? I've got the torso, right? We've got the pelvic area. And what I'm going to do from here, because again, this is normally how I start. I start with that torso. But again, let's think about proportion. Okay, head's going to be somewhere up here, right? And then I've got one proportion there, one proportion down there. Let's make them a little bit bigger. We've got those real heroic legs. And I'm going to think about, okay, that's sort of the center of the balance. And now I'm going to put these legs sort of really far apart in a heroic posture. And then we can have the character, again, maybe looking this way. All right, big beard. And we can do, again, something I'm always playing with is big weapon over the shoulder. Boom, boom, boom. And this is where, again, logic and those little tricks you kind of learn will really help you. It's a lot better, and if you're ever drawing a sword or a staff or something like that, you want to sort of draw it as a basic sort of line to think about, where does it sit? Does that sit over the shoulder? Does that feel right? And once you've sort of got it feeling right, the next thing is we can sort of place the hand where it needs to go. And once you've sort of placed the hand, it then becomes a lot easier to sort of connect that up with where the shoulder needs to be. Now, again, there's many different ways you can kind of hold something. So the elbow might be here, for instance, depending on where everything is. That is really where getting in front of a mirror, practicing these things will kind of help. But this is how we start the process and think about posing. It's sort of messy, it's kind of ugly, but the more you try this, the more you'll warm up, the more you'll get used to it. And once you have the posture that you need, then it's a lot easier to sort of recreate it at a larger scale with more detail. But this is sort of where we're at the moment. So I've got, again, where I bottom of the rib cage, that's where the elbow is. And then I'm like, okay, this hand's going to be somewhere over here. Big old hand there. Boom, boom. Now, once I've got that stuff kind of sorted, again, it's a little bit messy over here, but yeah, we can figure that out. There's lots of different options for how that might work. We can think about adding in that other structure. What I might do is give this pencil a quick sharpen. And what we'll do, this is always like a good option. Very, very simple technique is we just sort of take some of that graphite away so that when we create subsequent lines, they're going to be a little bit darker. But what we can do here, again, is similar. I'm going to build in those pectoral muscles. Right, we've got, that's where the neck is. We've got some traps, a deltoid there. Right, we've got this sort of shaft, we've got the hand. So I'm just blocking in that hand. Again, if we were to create, a more detailed version of this, we would obviously have to, draw out all the fingers and do all that sort of stuff. For the moment, we're just keeping it simple. And he's got a shoulder pad on that end. He's got a cape. Got some braids coming here. Got the beard going here. Right, boom, boom, boom. Oh, I think his ears go down, don't they? He doesn't have elf ears. He's got sort of goat ears. So anyway, there you go. That's basically how we sort of do that. And again, I can try and have a go at drawing those things. I can focus on structure. Really good idea to keep focusing on center line, where that center is. But yeah, here we've got, again, I'm just going to mass in where those thighs might be. Here we've got some sort of knees. Right, here we've got some different muscle groups down here. So again, ended up with a pretty sort of similar posture to what we had in the first place. But that's basically it, right? If we want an action pose, if we want a different type of posture, it's just a matter of thinking about how we build those muscles on top of that. If we want to sort of bring the arm up, it's just a matter of doing that, of trying to figure out how that happens, where those muscles go. You can redraw, you can sketch around, you can play around with it. And again, if you need to change something, right? So if I kind of say, hey, like this isn't quite feeling, how I sort of imagined, right? Let's have another go at doing this. In this case, I'm just going to make this arm feel a little bit bigger. Now, you can draw in the stick figure if you want. You can have a go. Totally up to you, right? This is your party. You can deal with it however you want. Right, so you can remember he has these sort of giant hands. Probably this thing is like maybe a bit bigger. Has its own structure. But that's the basic idea, right? We just kind of go through, add stuff on top, etc., etc. And that's the general idea. Now, again, we could keep going. I feel like this is probably a good place to leave it. What I'll try and do is maybe just create a few more videos in the future that really sort of go into different postures. So we can talk about how we create different versions of these postures, how we maybe do the same anatomical build-up if we're looking at different angles. And the other thing we obviously need to sort of cover that isn't really detailed here is, how do we do the final pass, all those tertiary forms, all the subtle details that go into the different muscle groups. So that stuff we're sort of roughing over here, but hopefully that gives you an idea for how the basic process works and what this is talking about, how important it is, and which bits of it are important for you if you want to draw cool, interesting stuff that is a lot more stylized, a lot more sort of extreme, a lot more exaggerated. We still want to have all the same muscles. You still study them. That's still useful. That's still interesting. I think that's, again, a really, really fun thing to do. But yeah, it's just a matter of combining those concepts and making sure you understand, again, proportion plus primary form. Those are the things that will really kind of help you in the beginning. If you just focus on the big forms, getting them in the right spot, posing things, continuing to get the proportions right as we pose, and continuing to put on the primary forms as we do that. So it's just a matter of building up those basic structures, and again, the better you get at it, the more you focus on, mastering that boring proportional stuff, the better your drawing will get, right? It does take a bit of time, and when you're sitting there just drawing boring skeletons from the front, you can sort of think about, is this really what I signed up for? Did I really want to be an artist? But again, at the end of the day, that is what will help you to get really good in the end. And in the end, you just get better at sort of guesstimating and sort of putting these primary forms on there, doing little sketches and making it feel good. You don't sort of think too much about skeletons or, any of this technical stuff. As with anything, the more technical your study is, the less technical your actual practice needs to be. Anyway, hopefully this one has been interesting. Let me know if some of those other video ideas are interesting to you, what you'd like to see. If anything here is not clear, you'd like me to expand upon it, be more than happy to. Other than that, catch you around. Happy drawing.